Find the second derivative f double prime of x for the function f of x equals x squared times 8 minus 2x to the 3/2 power. Then evaluate f double prime of 2. F of x here is the product of two functions, x squared times 8 minus 2x to the 3/2 power. The first derivative f prime of x will therefore make use of the product rule. And that will be the derivative of the first, 2x, times the second left alone, 8 minus 2x to the 3/2 power, plus the first left alone, x squared, times the derivative of the second. We'll start by bringing the power down, leave the inside alone, 8 minus 2x, subtract 1 from the power, I will call that 2/2, and then multiply by the derivative of the inside, a -2, to complete the chain rule. The first term I'm going to rewrite as is. In the second term, I'm going to multiply the constants. I have a 3/2 times a -2, which will give us a -6/2 or -3. We have an x squared, and we have the 8 minus 2x to the 3 minus 2 1/2 power. Now, if we were to take the second derivative from here, we would have a product rule for this term, minus, and a product rule for this term. And each of those product rules will involve that fractional exponent and will be quite messy. Another option is we can attempt to simplify our first derivative to make the second derivative easier to find. And that can be done by factoring. Now, we have a common factor of x in each, so we can factor an x out, or we have a common factor of 8 minus 2x to a power, and we can factor that out from each. We do not want to factor both, because if you factor out an x times an 8 minus 2x to a power, it will then be times the leftover expression, which will also have x's in it, and you'll have a triple product. And you'll have to use the triple product rule to find the derivative, which again will make the derivative more complex. So let's factor out just one of them, and I'm going to choose the 8 minus 2x to a power, the messier function. That will simplify it more. So let's factor out an 8 minus 2x to the, well, we have a 3/2 power and a 1/2 power. We can factor out the lower power of the two. That'll be the 1/2 power. So f prime of x will be 8 minus 2x to the 1/2 power times. Now remember, factoring means division. You're dividing it out, and dividing means subtraction of exponents. We're factoring, or dividing out, a power of 1/2. We're therefore going to be subtracting a 1/2 from the 3/2. 3/2 minus 1/2 will become a 1. And from the other term, we're taking the entire thing out. And there's what we're going to have left over in the square brackets. 2x times 8 minus 2x, and then minus 3x squared. So we have 8 minus 2x to the 1/2 power. I'm going to distribute the 2x in here, and I will have 16x minus 4x squared, and then minus 3x squared, which gives us 8 minus 2x to the 1/2 power times 16x minus 4 minus 3 minus 7x squared. Now we have a product rule, just a single product rule here. So let's find our second derivative through the use of this product rule. F double prime of x will be the derivative of the first. Start with the power. Bring the power down, 1/2. Leave the inside alone, 8 minus 2x. Subtract 1 from the power. I will call that 2/2. Multiply by the derivative of the inside, which is a -2, to complete the chain rule. All of that times the second left alone, plus the first left alone times the derivative of the second, which will be a 16 minus 14x. Now in the first term I have a 1/2 and a -2. If we multiply those we end up with -2/2 or -1. We have an 8 minus 2x to the 1 minus 2 -1/2 power, and we have a 16x minus a 7x squared. And the second term I'm going to leave as is, 8 minus 2x to the 1/2 power times 16 minus 14x. So there's our second derivative, f double prime of x, though it's not in its simplified form just yet. So now we are going to want to simplify it. And that's going to be done by factoring out whatever we can. And there's actually powers of 8 minus 2x and everything. We have an 8 minus 2x to the -1/2 and an 8 minus 2x to the +1/2. We can factor out the lower power of the two, and that's the -1/2 power. So let's factor out an 8 minus 2x to the -1/2 power. Factoring means subtraction. This time we're factoring out a -1/2, and therefore we're subtracting a -1/2, which is equivalent to adding a 1/2. Now this first term we're factoring out the entire thing, so we're just taking that whole thing out. The second term, we have a 1/2 power. We're going to be factoring out or subtracting a -1/2 minus a -1/2 is equivalent to adding a 1/2. If you add 1/2 to this 1/2 here, it becomes a 1. And there's what we should have left over in the square brackets. We will have a negative. We will have a 16x minus 7x squared. We will have an 8 minus 2x to the first power, and we will have a 16 minus 14x. So we have 8 minus 2x to the -1/2. I'm going to distribute the negative in here. Negative 16x plus 7x squared. And I'm going to FOIL out this. 8 times 16 is 128. 8 times -14x is -112x. -2x times 16 is a -32x. And a -2x times a -14x is a +28x squared. We can now combine together like terms in the square brackets. And f double prime of x will be 8 minus 2x to the -1/2 power times. We have a 7x squared and a 28x squared. Let's combine those together for a 35x squared. We have a -16x, a -112x, and a -32x. -16 minus 112 is -128, and then minus 32 more is -160 times x. And then we have the plus 128, and that's the only constant. Now in our next step, I'm going to move the -1/2 power to the denominator and call it a +1/2 power. The square bracket expression will stay in the numerator. So all this will be divided by 8 minus 2x to the +1/2 power. And one more step, +1/2 power means first power, second root, or just square root. So I'll leave the numerator alone, but I can rewrite the denominator as the square root of 8 minus 2x. There's the simplified version of the second derivative, f double prime of x. Now the next thing to do here is to evaluate f double prime of 2, which means to plug a 2 in for each of the x's. We will have 35 times 2 squared minus 160 times 2 plus 128, all divided by the square root of 8 minus 2 times 2. 35 times 2 squared is a 4. Minus 160 times 2 is negative 320 plus 128. All over the square root of 8 minus 2 times 2 is a minus 4. 35 times 4 is a 140 minus a 320 plus 128 divided by the square root of 8 minus 4, which is 4. 140 minus 320 is negative 180 plus 128 divided by the square root of 4, which is a 2. Negative 180 plus 128 is a negative 52 over 2. Let's now divide each by 2, and we end up with a negative 26.